All right. So questions. What questions would you like to start with tonight?
So first, I looked over the homework and then I tried to look over the exam questions from the previous semesters. So for the homework, on question number 1, it says that there's a the original thing kind of says that there's a decrease in investment spending in the economy.
Yeah, and then it says something
then-
about consumers, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
So
that's actually
because
that's actually a misprint, but you can answer.
I still got the same outcome.
Yeah.
I still got the same outcome, but instead, because it said a decrease in consumer spending in the goods market graph, I did an increase in savings desired.
Right. So what you'll end
Is
up
that
with
okay?
what you'll end up with is a different impact on the interest rate. Right. So in either case, Y is going to go which way?
Decrease.
Right.
So that's okay.
So yeah, I'm thinking through something in my head right now. So right. So the actual, hold on, let me shift the sharing so everybody knows what we're talking about here. I actually just noticed that this weekend when I was doing the solutions to the homework. I had not. What happened was there was a different question that was similar. I just changed which thing it was, and I didn't go all the way through and correct or change all of them. Right. So hold on. I'm pulling it up behind the scenes here, and I will get to that and bring it up on share that screen so everyone knows what we're talking about. So homework number 6. So let's screen. So here is the actual homework question. I have too many screens open on. I'm going to shut my chat down. So if I don't respond to a chat, I should be able to see it. But if I don't, if you have something in the chat, just let me know at some point. All right. So decrease in investment spending. All right. So that needs to be there. Like that's in bold. That is the question, right? So you need to respond to that. Now, now it says the decrease in consumer spending. No one asked me about this. That's interesting, right? No one brought it up like, hey, is there a problem with that? Yes, in terms of grading that, I will be fairly lenient on that one. All right. So now so in that case, all right, as you said, we're going to end up in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, it's going to look exactly the same. Right?
Okay, so
now,
yeah, I got that.
In the goods market, that's where the difference will be. All right.
Okay.
But all right, so let's just kind of go through that, right? So that there's no confusion, right? Thank you for asking that question. So let's share my. So. Sorry, when it shares a new screen, it puts it right in the middle, but I have all of you over to the side. There we go. All right, so let's first of all think about a decrease in desired investment. All right, let's just, all right, we'll just look at that first, okay? And then we can compare that to a reduction in desired consumption. Okay. So RIS, desired investment, desired saving. All right, so here's the equilibrium real interest rate to start with. All right. And if there's a reduction in desired investment, whoops. All right, it's going to shift that line to the left. All right, we're good so far?
Yes.
Yes.
So equilibrium real interest rate falls, level of investment and saving falls. All right, so A to B. Now let's go over here and do that over here. Desired investment, desired saving. Same R0 we start with, all right? A. Now, if there is a decline in consumer spending, what happens? Did you say, Jasmine?
There's an increase in savings.
Right.
Okay, good. That's just like kind of what I wanted to clarify. I wanted to make sure that I interpreted that correctly.
Yeah. And I hate when mistakes like that happen. I work really hard to not do it because we have enough to learn without confusing you. And so my apologies for that. Like I said,
I have a question from this.
but hold on.
Sorry.
Well, okay. I mean, okay, go ahead on this, because I'm going to finish this out to make the point
Okay.
that's different. And that will mean in terms of ISLM, it's going to be different, but in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, it's not going to be different.
It's going to be the same because.
Right, but Faith, did you want to ask? You want to go ahead and ask your
No,
question?
that's what I was asking. What's the difference? Because I see
Right.
that the IS, can you label like from 1 to 2, or kind of like, not obviously it's not in like a sequential type of thing. It's like when something adjusts, they all, simultaneously
Right.
adjust.
I'm using
But
A and B. I'm using A and B.
No, I'm saying as far as like, this is the aggregate demand graph, and this is the asset market, and this is, so we can kind of see like the flip side.
You should know that by now, but yeah, here you go. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm just saying I shouldn't have to label that, but that's okay. That's okay. So you should be able to tell just by the curves that are there and what's on the axes. IS and LM, right? That's the ISLM model. Right, and then aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. Okay, we good? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay, so let's do this. So ISLMFE, right? So this is chapter 4. This is chapter 9. Right. So what happens in the goods market? The equilibrium real interest rate fell, right, for the same level of GDP, right? So that means same, so low, so this is R0 from up above. Same level of Y to start with here. So lower real interest rate in equilibrium. IS curve shifts down. The interest rate has to be lower because that's what we saw up here, all right? And the level of Y is lower. So if we started at full employment, the full employment line would be here. So Y0 would have been full employment. Okay. So we end up at B. Okay. Now, let me make a little more space down here. This is going to be, well, come on. This is going to be average demand, average supply. So, whoops, sorry. I'm ahead of myself here. Let's just start with the short run, long run. There we go. Just got to slow down here. Long run, average supply, aggregate demand. Short run, average supply. Little zeros by that. Price level on the axis, real GDP on the horizontal axis. Y0, all right, same Y0 as right above, all right? And what happens? At a lower level of GDP, right? For the same price level, that has to do with spending. So aggregate demand has shifted to the left. Now, that should make sense to you, right? Even without doing the graph. The graph is just verifying this, really, proving it, all right? Because what we're saying is that there's less spending. Aggregate demand is spending. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. And if I has gone down, nothing else has changed. Aggregate demand's got to go down, shift to the left. All right, so now let's look at what happens with a reduction in consumer spending. Right. Like I said, I'm willing to go with either one of these, even though the main part of the homework question in bold says what happens if there's a decline in investment spending. Now, if you could do both, and it would just amplify the impact ultimately. Come on, my wrist on the iPad is causing all sorts of issues here. It shouldn't be. So this is the case. Remember, this is the case. Decline in consumer spending. This is the case in decline in desired investment. All right. Spending by firms, spending by consumers, both part of aggregate demand. So, in terms of ISLM-FE, right? We start out in pen. So this is the full employment line. This is right potential GDP. Start out at A, R0, same R0, every one of these. In this case, consumer spending is going down. The real interest rate's going down. Right, the equilibrium real interest rate in the goods market is going down. I and S are going to end up being larger, right? That's going to be different. But in this case, right, it's also going to be the case that what happens? IS shifts down into the left, right? All right. So Jasmine, are you with, right? Thumbs up on that?
Yeah.
All right.
I understood it after you did
No,
the
yeah, no,
other
I just want to make
example.
sure. Well, I want to go through it for everybody to make sure everybody understands, because we're getting kind of a 2-for-1 here. This is kind of a twofer, all right? So I'm going to come back and say why that is. What do I mean by that? All right. So what's aggregate demand, aggregate supply going to look like?
It's also going to shift to the left.
Yeah, it's going to look exactly the same as that one on the left.
Because whatever impacts IS or LM impacts aggregate demand in the same way.
That's right.
And that kind of leads to my next question.
Like that is a critical point, actually, that you're making, right? Because if you make that point, it tells me something that's a fundamental idea, and that you say, oh, I get that. because that shows me that you've got sort of at a deeper level of thinking. So, and what else would cause these curves to look exactly the same down below?
If the actual GDP was lower than the potential GDP.
Yes. Well, a
Okay,
shift
that's-
left of aggregate demand, a shift left of IS. What else would cause
Yeah.
that? What else would cause that?
Mm,
I'm going to get
A
really
shift left of LM.
no, well, we can talk about that, but first of all, that's going to be correct as well. But what else causes a shift left of IS and therefore a shift left of aggregate demand? We did these two: reduction in I, reduction in C.
Oh, like, yeah, I was gonna say increase or decrease in expected future output, decrease in wealth,
Right, but let's talk.
decrease in any of those.
Let's talk. Yeah, we talked about. Whoops. Oh, come on. So we talked about this one. We talked about that one.
So decrease in government spending.
Decrease in government spending. Yeah. So, right. So part of the point here is like, it's easier than you think. There's stuff to know here, right? There's a lot to know here, but because it's putting everything together, but there's not as much here as you think. Right? Any of those things, and you can prove that, because what would that do? What would that do? A decrease in government spending is gonna do what? It's gonna do exactly, whoops, oh, come on here. It's going to do exactly that. It's going to increase government saving, right? An increase in or decrease in consumption increases private saving, but a decrease in government spending is going to increase government saving. So the graphs are going to look exactly the same as a decrease in consumer spending. The graphs are exactly the same. So when you go through that, so we're essentially not going to worry about net exports. We're going to assume that we have a closed economy. So we're just not going to worry about that. So now we've gotten only down to three things. Now the question becomes, right? As you were kind of alluding to there, Jasmine, is what causes a change in C, right? What are the things underneath that, right? That's the stuff we learned in chapter 4. We also learned about what are the things that affect investment spending, things in chapter 4. This has to do with desired saving. This one has to do with desired investment. Right? So things like you said, a change in wealth. You win the lottery. 2 people in California won the $2 billion or $2 billion last week, but right, so you didn't win that one. But all right, if wealth goes up, your wealth goes up, what's going to happen to consumer spending? If you won the lottery, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to your spending? Yeah, exactly. It's going to increase, right? You're going to buy a new house, you're going to buy a new car, you're going to buy whatever, and for your friends and family and everybody else, right? So, so what does that mean? That means a decline in saving, right? Desired saving, right? In that case, right? So it's the opposite of this, right? Decline in saving is going to be a shift to the left of the saving curve. Right. So private saving, right, is going to go down. Desired consumption is going to go up, right? Because wealth doesn't change your income. So we're talking about how much you spend out of your current income. It's going to increase because you have more wealth, bigger bank account, bigger whatever, right? And so if private saving goes down, okay, what happens? The IS, so that's the opposite of the examples above, the IS shifts right. Right, aggregate demand to the right. Right. So anything that causes spending to increase is going to cause aggregate demand to do what?
To the right.
Shift to the right. So what happened in this example? Consumer spending goes down, business spending goes down. What happens to the business cycle here? What happens to
Well,
real
it's
GDP?
in a recession
They're in a recession.
because the
Real-
actual GDP is lower than the potential.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Thank you. Perfect. That's
So
so why do we pay attention to consumer spending, like in the reports that come out in the Wall Street Journal or they don't come out in the Wall Street Journal, they write about them every month, the economic indicators, right? Why do we care about that? Because what did we learn in chapter 2? Consumer spending is 2/3 of GDP. What happens with consumers drives the economy, drives business cycles, right? So you said before, how else could you get, now we can work backwards. What else could cause aggregate demand to increase? Well, anything that causes the equilibrium real interest rate in the, I take that back. In this case, it could be an increase in the IS curve, shifted to the right, right? Aggregate demand increasing, right? Or, right, it could be, right, the Federal Reserve shifting the LM curve to the right, right, and lowering interest rates, right? They shift the LM curve to the right, we're going to end up beyond full employment, right? Aggregate demand shifts to the right in that case. So, yeah, you can start to see the pattern. See, if you do enough of these examples, you start to see the patterns, right? LM curve shifts to the right, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. If IS curve shifts to the right, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to what's going to happen to aggregate demand?
It's going to shift to the right as well.
Right. Now the question,
Increasing.
right? So you can memorize things like that.
Expansion.
Right. Exactly. So you can memorize things like that. That'll get you to 70 or 80 points out of 100. Now,
So Dr. Simpkins,
yep.
before we get too far, I have a question.
Yep.
So previously we were talking about decreases
Yep.
in investment and consumption, right?
Yep.
So with these graphs, if it was the inverse as far as like an increase in these,
That's what
would
I
it
was just, that's what we're just talking about. Yep. That's exactly
Right.
what we're talking about. Yep. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to make sure that we were on the right track. So it would just change the graphs to where it would just be the opposite.
Yep.
Like the curve, instead of being a shift down to the left, would be a shift up to the right.
Yep.
Okay.
Now, so like I said, you can memorize that. Like you can put that on your note sheet, right?
Right.
You could put that on your note sheet. That's what we mean by, going from the book and going from the examples to now I'm starting to process it, right, in my brain and really writing it down as my notes, right? And if you do that, it's going to stick. It's going to stick. Now, what you need to do from that is you can't stop there. You got to say, why is that? Right? And because you can just talk about shifting the curves, and you can say, well, what would cause that? Well, if it's an increase in desired investment, what's going to happen to the desired investment curve in that case, right? The opposite of this picture, right? It shifts to the right instead. Well, what's going to happen? The equilibrium real interest rate is going to rise. That's a shift upward in the IS curve, right? And that's going to push us out beyond potential GDP, and that's a shift to the right of aggregate demand, right? So we need to be able to kind of think back through that once you have the basic idea down, right? So we can memorize what these shifts are, and that's okay. That's not a problem, right? That helps us understand. It'll help you understand it, but then you need to make sure that you go backwards again from that and work it through to the underlying markets. In this case, the goods market, right? And make sure that it's all consistent and that it makes sense. a shift to the LM curve, for example, like over here. Now we're mixing things up into the graphs here, but the shift to the LM curve is going to reduce the real interest rate. So what's happening in the asset market, in the money market, the Federal Reserve is increasing the money supply, shifting that money supply curve to the right, decreasing the real interest rate in the asset market, in the money market. Well, that's what happens. The real interest rate is going to go down when the LM curve shifts to the right. So you should be able to go back and forth from the underlying markets up to the ISLM, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then also be able to go backwards the other way.
So when they increase the money supply, that causes inflation, correct?
Yeah, so let's think that through. That's a good question. So increase the money supply, right? And the way that comes out in the news, right, is they reduce the Fed funds rate, right? They reduce the interest rate. We're going to show why that is, right? So in the asset market, here's real money demand. Here's real money supply, right? So let's hold the price level constant there. This is the amount of money supplied, demanded, the real interest rate, and then just the real amount of money, right? So this is our starting point. If the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, and why are they doing that? They're doing that to decrease the interest rate, right?
All right.
So if they do that, the top part of this, of the real money supply, increases. So if they increase the money supply from M0 to M1, money supply, where M1 is bigger, money supply is greater than the money supply M0, right? So it's an increase. That's going to now MS1 over P0, right, is out here to the right, right? The money supply is, this is M0, this is M1, P0. Price level hasn't changed yet, right? Short run, price level hasn't changed yet. So what's going to happen? That's how they reduce the real interest rate, right? Federal funds rate. That's how they do it. Actually, it's not exactly how they do it, but it's fine. It works for us. It'll work for our model.
But what was the question again? It had
Yeah,
to do
we're
with
not there
inflation.
yet. This is only step
But
one.
I just want to be reminded of the question.
Yeah. I'm gonna say it as I set this up. The next graph. All right. The comment that was made was that, oh, doesn't that increase inflation? All right. So here's the question. All right. Here's the comment. Let's prove whether it's true. Does this increase inflation? All right. That's the question. And right now, the hypothesis is on the floor that it does. All right. Actually, we learned that back in chapter, it was as a question actually on the last exam. In chapter 7, inflation is positively correlated with, connected to growth rate in the money supply. Okay. So we actually know that's true from the data. And we know that already. Our model then can prove it, right? So the top graph here is what what's happening in the money market, right? To Faith's point, here's the money market. All right, now let's see what happens in terms of ISLM and FE. And then we'll do aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Right, so this is the underlying market up above. The whole general equilibrium is either ISLM FE or aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, or both typically. I'll ask you about both, because one tells us about the price level, one tells us about the real interest rate. Both of them tell us about real GDP. Right, so ISLM, full employment, real interest rate, real GDP. This is potential GDP, all right? This is full employment GDP. So now, starting point. We'll assume that we're starting at full employment. So something happens, increase the money supply. Which curve? IS or LM or FE? Which one's going to shift?
LM.
LM. Right? LM, the liquidity, that has to do with money demand. Demand for liquidity. Money is the most liquid asset, right? And money, like money supply. That's what the LM stands for there. Why is it LM? Well, this is like equal. Liquidity, money demand equals money supply. That's where that comes from, right? So just, what is IS? I equals S. It's the goods market.
Investment and saving.
Yeah. It's equilibrium in the goods market. Liquidity money supply is equilibrium in the money market. So every point on the LM curve is an equilibrium point in the money market. Every point on the IS is where I equals S. It's an equilibrium in the goods market for different levels of GDP. So LM curve is going to shift, right? So let's start with R0, right? So LM curve is going to shift which way? What happened to the real interest rate in the asset market?
It went down.
Yeah, so which way does the interest rate, which way does LM have to shift?
Down and right.
Down to the right, because if we shifted it up and to the left, interest rate would go up.
We're rising.
Can't happen. That would be inconsistent with what's going on in the money market. Right? So that's the way you can check yourself. That's the way you can make sure that you're really understanding the connections between the markets, right? So, because it can't be it can't be going up in one place and down in the other, because they all have to be consistent. That's the point of the whole deal, right? So LM curve shifts down to the right. What happens to the equilibrium interest rate? It goes down to R1. And what happens to GDP?
It reduces.
No, we were here before, right? We were here. This is
Wait,
GDP in these axes,
sorry.
right? And now it's here, right? So it's bigger, smaller,
Yeah, it's larger.
larger. So GDP is going up. What do we call that? What part of the business cycle are we in?
Expansion.
That's an expansion. Yeah, business cycle expansion. So to know what happens with inflation, we got to have aggregate demand, aggregate supply, because that's where P is up on the vertical axis, right? So we got Y on this axis, P. This is like the consumer price index, the personal consumption expenditure index, right? That's what we mean by P. It's the price level for the whole economy, right? This is stuff we learned about back in chapter 2, measuring the economy.
What's the PCE?
The personal consumption expenditure index.
Oh, okay.
Actually, what the Federal Reserve uses, go back in chapter 2, look at that, and you'll actually see that's what the Federal Reserve focuses its attention on, to better measure than the CPI of inflation in the economy. Actually, we talked about that at the time back in chapter 2. So, but it can be either one of those. Generally, they follow each other pretty closely. But the Federal Reserve actually looks at when it's doing its policy, it looks at that. So, aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply. All right, so I didn't draw this one exactly right above the other one or right below the other one. This Y potential is the same as the one above, right? So this is like the same there. I just drew it a little further over. Not intentional, just happened to be that one. Short run aggregate supply curve 0, 0. Right. All right. So this is point A. This is our starting point. Like we could have drawn all these graphs, the starting point, all at the same time to begin with before we shifted any curves. We could have done that, right? So let's get them all together on the same page here. So if the LM curve, so what's happened to GDP when the LM curve shifted? Oops.
It increased.
It increased, right? So this has to do with spending, right? Right? LM curves, IS and LM have to do with aggregate demand. So which way does the aggregate demand curve have to shift? What happened to
Up and to the
GDP?
right.
All right, has to shift to the up and to the right. Why? Because if we shifted aggregate demand to the left, what would happen to GDP?
It would go down.
It would go down, but it didn't. All right, that's not what we have in the other graph up above. All right, so it has to go to the right. All right, so right, Y1, right? This is B, same as the B up here in the second graph. Now, so we can ask a question, what's happening? So if there's something going on, so we have the IS curve, or sorry, the LM curve shifting, it's a move along the IS curve to a new equilibrium in the goods market because it's along the IS curve. So what's happening in the goods market? All right, because we got R there as well, we got I and S, all right, desired investment, desired saving, all right. Whoops.
Wouldn't savings increase if the federal funds rate decreased?
Come on. So question, yeah, well, so we can figure this out mechanically, and then we can think through the economics, right? So, nothing's happened to desired investment, right? It's but as GDP, well, probably anyway, as GDP, it's not one of the things that comes in our model. We'll talk about what I mean by that in a second, right? What's happening is you get more income. What happens to consumption?
It goes up.
All right, you get more money, you're gonna spend it, but do you spend all of your extra money?
No.
No, you save some of it. At least that's our assumption. That's the MPC, marginal propensity to consume, being less than 1. In reality, that might be true for some people. Like they might spend it all, right? Especially if somebody has lower income, they might spend it all because they need to, right? To get food or drugs or medical drugs is what I mean by that, all right, or whatever, right? Prescriptions, whatnot. So what's going to happen? Well, we know that the real interest rate, right, from the ISLM model, we know the real interest rate has to go down. Well, there are only two ways that can happen. Either desired investment shifts to the left or desired saving shifts to the right. And in this case, that's right. Desired saving is going to increase, right? That's going to reduce the real interest rate, lead to more investment, and lead to more saving. All right, so this is A. This is B. Okay, let's spread that out. All right, this is B down here. All right, so everything's consistent. R1, real interest rate went down, all right? Saving increased. Consumption's behind the scenes, right? It's the other side of saving, right? But also GDP went up, so consumption went up. So interest rate, we know nothing's happened to the price level, right? At this point, we know that GDP has gone up. Now, in the short run, our labor market works in the long run, what we learned about in chapter 3, but in the short run, the assumption is that firms need to produce more, they need to hire more workers. Produce less, hire fewer workers. So employment's going to go up. It's sitting behind the scenes. The Keynesian, the fixed prices and wages doesn't really work with the labor market the way we learned about it in chapter 3, because that assumed that wages were flexible. That would be true if it was the classical model and prices and wages adjust quickly, right? But in terms of employment, it really depends. If in the short run, it depends on spending and how firms respond to the spending. In the Keynesian view of the world, firms respond to spending by either increasing their output or decreasing. And they need workers to do that. All right. Now, so we're at B. Remember the question. Does an increase in the money supply cause an increase in inflation? Right? in chapter 7, right? We learned that, yes, it does. But here we are at B. And what's happened to the price level?
It's the same.
It's the same. We got a problem. Right?
But that's in the short run, right?
That's right.
Okay.
So why are we not going to stay at B? That is exactly right.
Because if you increase money supply, don't you also, well, actually, never mind. I actually don't think.
So here, right here, right? B, here's the level of aggregate demand. Spending, right? Here's the productive capacity of the economy at full employment. We're beyond full employment, right? So here is aggregate supply. What's true at B? At B, what's true?
Why did you turn that to aggregate supply?
What's that? Pardon?
I said, why did you turn the full employment? Why did you turn that into aggregate supply?
See what I'm circling up there? Long run aggregate
No,
supply?
no, under the Y0.
I
You
know,
put A.
by potential, I know, because that's the productive capacity, that's supply, that's what the economy can produce.
Because when
And full employment,
GDP, so basically when it's over potential GDP, that means we need a higher full employment. Right.
see me waving? See me waving my hands?
Yes.
So this just goes back to the basic economics you learned in sophomore year. Demand and supply. This is demand for the whole economy, right? The economy is really, so here's a question I could ask you tomorrow. Write me the headline for what's happening in the economy. And give me a paragraph, the lead paragraph in the Wall Street Journal article. That could be a question. Right? So what would the article say? What would the headline say? Fed reduces interest rate, pushes economy beyond full employment. Economy is booming. Lots of demand for goods and services. Lots of lower interest rates. People are buying more cars. People are buying more houses. Firms are borrowing more money for new capital. Factories are humming. Unemployment is low. Employment is high. Economy's doing great. But if you push the economy too far, too much spending beyond potential GDP, what starts to happen? You push unemployment rate too low, firms can't find workers. What do they have to do? They got to raise their wages, got to increase prices, right? So the economy, aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. So beyond the potential of the economy, can't sustain that. You might be able to for a short while, but, and so what happens? Anytime as demand is greater than supply, prices start to go up. The short run aggregate supply curve is really the marker of the price level here. When are prices going to stop going up? When
And
we're
it's equilibrium.
back in general equilibrium. That's right. Because we got general equilibrium means when all three curves intersect at the same place. If they don't all intersect at the same place, we're not in the long run. We're not in general equilibrium. We're not at the end of the story. How do we get to the end of the story? The price level adjusts. If we wanted to finish that story, the price level goes up. What happens to the LM curve? It shifts back to the left. Why? Because in the money market, if the price level goes up, it pushes that curve back to the left again. right? Because now it becomes P1. P1 is bigger than P0. So this just goes back to here, goes back to R0. LM curve just back to the left. A and C are the same point. We're back at full employment again. All right, so the price level. So anything happens to move the economy out of general equilibrium. Here's the general takeaway. Here's the general point. If there's anything that happens to shock the economy out of general equilibrium, either policy, the Federal Reserve here, right? It could be, right? So one of the questions on the past exams, right, says, well, okay, this was back when President Trump was in office during one of those semesters, and talks about a tax cut. I mean, that was real. That really happened, right? A reduction in taxes. We all pay, by the way, we all have less money taken out of our weekly paychecks because of that tax cut during the Trump administration. Like, that didn't just happen then, like, that has continued. So what does that do? Well, that would push aggregate demand to the right in exactly the same way, but it would be for a different reason. It wouldn't be because the LM curve shifted right. It'd be because the IS curve shifted to the right. A reduction in taxes increases consumer spending, which shifts the IS curve to the right. But what happens if you do that at full employment? You're already at full employment. It's only going to it's just going to cause, right, the price level to go up ultimately with no change. We're just back at full employment with higher prices, inflation. So what does the Federal Reserve try to do? It tries to use interest rates to keep the economy just right. Right. So the Federal Reserve, let me do this in terms, what's the deal right? What's the deal right now in terms of the Federal Reserve, right? So what do they have to know, right? So
There's enough full employment.
Right. So they have to figure out, why do they have 400 PhD economists at the Federal Reserve, which is what they do. They have some of them are working on models, right? And right, so they are. This was another question that I'm trying to think whether it was on the homework, right? So why would the Federal Reserve raise interest rates? Because if they raise interest rates, right, starting at A, right, if we're starting at full employment, this is potential GDP, we're at full employment, general equilibrium. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, so the Fed raises interest rates, that's what they're doing, right? That's what they've been doing this year, right? Big time. And they're going to continue raising them in December, some more. Why would they do that? Because if they do that, what's going to happen? So if you do enough of these, you practice enough of these, you'll know, right? You need to be able to go through it and prove it, right? In the asset market, what happens? It shifts the money supply curve to the left, raises the equilibrium real interest rate, which shifts the LM curve to the left, right? But if you do that enough times, you say, oh, I know that's going to shift the LM curve to the left. You still
But
need to
couldn't money demand going to the left also shift?
It could, but it doesn't. But money demand doesn't shift around so much like that. So so that's another thing. That's another thing. That's another thing you can kind of tuck away. And even if it did, the Federal Reserve can always change the money supply however much it wants to get whatever interest rate it wants.
Yeah.
So it needs to know what you're right in the sense it needs to know whether the money demand is shifting around or not. But generally, money demand is not moving that wildly, right? So, but even if it did, it can, all it needs to do is adjust the money supply some more to get the interest rate to where it wants, right? So even if it did, right? So let's say it's not moving, all right? So why would the Federal Reserve want to do this? Because what's going to happen in the economy? What's going to happen? What happens to GDP?
It reduces.
Yeah, we call that a what?
Recession.
Recession.
So wouldn't the Federal Reserve?
Why does it want to
wanna
cause a
do
recession?
that?
Because unemployment rate goes up, people are out of work. Why would they want to do that?
To jump
Would
start
it
the
be because
economy.
original?
All right, so go ahead, Jasmine. I'm sorry.
Well, actually, I want to hear what Leon said because I don't
Okay.
know if what I'm saying is right.
Okay.
So the question was, why would they, well, I was gonna say that they wanted to jumpstart the economy by getting people to spend money.
If they raise the interest rate,
No, the interest rate is raised, so they wanna reduce the rate. In order to do that, you need people to start spending money, so you can give them like tax cuts, or like how you give people stimulus payments and stuff like that.
why is so in the news for the last year, you all know this because you experience it. You experience it at the gas pump. You experience it if you go out to eat. You experience it if you go to the grocery store. Why is the Federal Reserve raising interest rates?
To increase consumer spending? No, that doesn't make sense. I don't know.
It's in the news every day. It was in the news for the election. It was what Republicans were running on in the election.
Employment?
What's that?
Employment?
No, not employment. Employment's doing
Something
great.
with the economy.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
I don't know.
Yes, you do. You experience it. Every week you experience it.
Inflation.
Yeah. How much does it cost to buy your groceries? How much does it cost to buy? Well, gasoline actually is going the other direction. So that's actually working in the other direction right at the moment. That's helping to bring inflation maybe a little bit lower. But what's happening with if you go out to eat? What's happening if you buy groceries?
Everything costs more.
Everything costs more. Inflation. Right? So how do you bring down inflation? You reduce
You gotta raise the rates.
Yeah, well, you're right. And you got what are you trying to do? All right, you're trying to
Trying to increase the value of the dollar.
Yes. So
Lower the price level?
yes, or at least keep it from going up, right? If you kept it from going up, you'd have 0% inflation, right?
Well, I have a question.
So hold on for just a second, right? So what are they trying to, so if they do this, remember IS or LM shift to the left, what's going to happen over here? But just think about it without even thinking about the curves. If you raise interest rates, what happens?
If you raise rates, inflation goes down.
Yes, and why? Because the cost of borrowing's gone up, right?
Right.
You're not going. So what happened? So what do you think's happening to auto sales right now?
They're going down.
Yeah, they are, because people won't buy as many cars because they got to borrow money generally to buy the cars, right? On average, and like, right? What's happening to housing? What's happening to housing?
I was gonna say, well, before we get too far, my question kind of ties into this. So we're talking about prices and how they're going up, but if I'm not mistaken, the prices truly don't change. It's just that the value of the money goes down, so it takes more money to buy those items.
That's the same as the price level going up. Same thing. That's what the price level going up means.
Okay. So price level is just a definition of what I just said.
So it's just the other way around of what you're saying. So when the price level goes up, your money doesn't buy as much.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
So prices are going up. Like not every, so now we got to go back to chapter 2, right? So we did a homework actually in chapter 2, where some prices of some goods go up, some went down, but overall the consumer price index increased.
Okay.
More prices are going up than are coming down. So gasoline might be coming down.
Well, other things are still going.
Prices of all sorts of other things are going up. How do we measure the price index? The consumer price index. It's a index. It's a market basket of all the goods and services that a typical urban wage earner would purchase.
Okay.
So if you asked anybody, if you're reading the Wall Street Journal, you would see this almost every day in the Wall Street Journal. And if you just ask your parents, ask an aunt and uncle, ask a grandparent, what's happening to your cost of living? Going up. If you were graduated, you were on your first job, you'd say, snap, I can't buy as much now as I could a year ago, unless my salary went up to go with that.
Mhm.
Prices, the inflation, so things cost about 10%, roughly 10% more now than they did a year ago. Not everything, but on average. If you are a state employee in North Carolina, you're a faculty member, you're a department chair, you're whatever, our raise this year was 3.5%.
Mhm.
We're losing money.
Right.
But did our paychecks go up? Yes. But those paychecks don't buy as many groceries. So real terms, we're losing. Our real income is going down, right? So let's go back to the main question here. Why would the Federal Reserve want to do? Why would they want? Well, they want to fight inflation, right? They want to bring inflation down. Why? That was one of the issues that Republicans in the midterm elections were running on, saying, look, under the Biden administration, your income doesn't go as far. You can't get as much stuff. You got to make decisions like, you're going to buy medicine, you're going to buy food, because your own income's not going to go as far, right? The economy mattered. Now, didn't matter enough. That didn't matter enough to enough voters, right? So Republicans are looks like they're going to gain the House, but not the Senate. Didn't gain the Senate, right? So, but it mattered for people, right? And that's what they were running on.
So can
So-
we go back to your main question of
Right,
why? the Federal Reserve-
exactly, right. So why are they doing that? Why do they want to cause a recession? What are they assuming? What is the Federal Reserve trying to do? The Federal Reserve, right? They have to forecast ahead what's going to happen, what they think is going to happen in the economy when they make policy now. They can't wait for it to happen or too late. And actually, they did that. They waited too long, right? So what are they assuming? They're assuming that the IS curve is going to shift out to the right. Aggregate demand is has shifted out to the right. We're beyond potential GDP. That was the case at following in 2021. Like, people were spending like mad. It was crazy. People had saved up money. They got pent up demand from people not being able to be out. COVID regulations were relaxed in 2021. People could go out, go travel, etc. Spending. Let's start with aggregate demand. Aggregate demand was way up in 2021. So what was happening? Demand was outpacing supply. You heard about this all the time. You go to a restaurant, there's more demand, right? There aren't enough workers, right? There are not enough cars for all the people that wanted to buy cars after COVID, partly due to supply chain issues, but also so demand was greater than supply. Used cars didn't matter. So what was happening? Prices were going up, right? So A to B, right? And so if they didn't want that to happen, and so if the Federal Reserve does nothing, right, then we end up at C with higher prices. But what if the Federal Reserve, if they did it early enough, they could push aggregate demand back, and so C just is back at A, no change in the price level. So they're trying to keep aggregate demand from pushing out to AD1, right? So up here, that's the same as saying, well, they're trying to keep, so consumer spending goes up, that pushes our IS curve out to the right, to the same level of income, right? Because people's savings had boosted up, people were spending more out of their current income, and so this is boosting up. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to push the economy back, right? So it's A, B, and C, back at full employment, right? To go with this C down here. The Federal Reserve is trying to offset demand. pushing aggregate demand back. How else could we have kept the inflation from happening? How else could you push aggregate demand back? You could raise taxes, you could reduce government spending. Any of those things would have pushed aggregate demand back to the left. But the Federal Reserve can use monetary policy to push aggregate demand back to the left. Actually, they can't make people spend less. All they can do is raise interest rates. But if they do that, they know that people will spend less because it's more expensive, right? People right now, young people in particular, right? Not only did house prices go up, but before interest rates were low. So they might be willing to pay a lot for the house. They could get a mortgage with a low interest rate. Now the prices are still pretty high, not as high, pretty high, but now interest rates are a percentage point or more higher. What does that mean? In a mortgage, if you have maybe a $200,000 mortgage, that might cost you a few $100s more a month.
Right.
If that's so, what people are saying, like, nope, I'm out.
Well, that's pushing a lot of younger people out the housing market in general because they can't afford it.
Exactly, and it's worse right now. Yep, exactly. Because the Federal Reserve's raising interest. So the question is, why would the Federal Reserve do that? They must be doing that for a reason.
All right.
They're doing that, and so why do they have all these economists at the Federal Reserve? They're doing forecasting models, which are essentially the econometric, right? Things that you learn in econometrics, right? Econ 314, except really big models of the whole economy. And they're trying to forecast what's going to happen 6 months from now, so that they can make decisions about whether to raise interest rates or lower interest rates or keep them the same when they meet every 6 weeks. And they need to be ahead of the curve. The problem was they're not. They're behind the curve. They messed up, right? They know that their models weren't giving them the right signals, partly because with COVID supply chain issues, we were kind of in uncharted territory for the models. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is like a correct theory. I was kind of saying, like, if actual GDP was higher than the potential GDP, like too high, could they is there ever a thing where they would want a recession to push it back?
No, they want to push it back enough to get to full employment.
So when it's over the potential GDP,
They want to push
isn't
it
it
back.
above full employment?
Yes. So they want to push
But
the
what is
economy.
above full employment mean?
So they want to push it back to be at full employment. So what does that mean in the real world? It means the unemployment rate might be at 3%, right? And maybe full employment is 4%. Right? So they want to push it down. They want to push the unemployment rate down. Actually, we're gonna talk about this over the next couple of weeks. We're in a different way. So the Federal Reserve was erring on the side. They're willing to err on the side of, oh, we're going to keep interest rates really low, the federal funds rate at 0 for a long time. Why? To boost the economy, right? To push aggregate demand out to the right, basically. And that would help employment, right? That would keep unemployment rate low, really low. And as long as inflation wasn't showing up, it was all good. But all of a sudden, inflation started to really move up. They were too late in starting to raise interest rates. Aggregate demand had moved too far out, basically. And now they need to take aggressive steps to push it back, to stuff it back to the left, but not so far that it causes a recession. They want to get it just right. That's really, really hard, right? So when they're talking about a soft landing in the news, when they're talking about trying to make a decision, trying to determine, we want to get the economy, we want to have lower inflation without causing a recession, that's what they're talking about. But that's really hard. All they can do is all they can do is the same thing we do, is we look at the data that comes out each day. It's talked about in the Wall Street Journal each day, whatever the economic indicators are each day, right? Is it GDP is that the indicator for this week? Is it employment this week? Is it housing starts this week? Is it automobile sales this week? Is it retail sales this week? Is it investment spending? And that helps them understand like what's happening to aggregate demand.
Yeah, so I was just gonna ask, so is that why certain things change throughout the months and everything? Certain items like gas or groceries or whatever?
It's really the other way around. Those things change the economy as opposed to the economy. Well, yeah, I mean, it's both, it goes both ways. It goes both ways. Right. So if the economy is slowing down because of higher interest rates, then there's going to be less demand overall because there are going to be more people unemployed. Not as much income in the economy being generated. So people aren't going to be buying as many groceries and gasoline. So the prices of those things is not going to go up as fast then. Yeah. So all these things are connected, but one of the things that you should sort of be getting at this point is that most of the action, not all and not always, but most of the action happens on the demand side. Right? Changes in aggregate demand are what cause recessions typically. Boosts in aggregate demand are what cause expansions. The question is, if we're in a recession, how can the government or how can the Federal Reserve boost the economy to get back to full employment, right? To get back to potential GDP. Because if they don't do anything, then the price level will adjust. That may take some time though. So if you're in a recession, you're below potential GDP, that's downward pressure on prices because there's more stuff being produced than there are people buying it, demanding it. That puts downward pressure on prices. But that could take a long time, right? It depends how flexible prices are. If prices are sticky, then you could be stuck in a recession for a long time. So it's always, so the policymakers are always looking at what's the effect on GDP and employment versus inflation. And they're trying to keep both of those things or all three of those things in balance. GDP and employment tend to go together, but inflation is, right? And they're trying to keep all of those in balance. And the tools that they have to do that with their fiscal and monetary policy, but changes in taxes, change in government spending, changes in interest rates by the Federal Reserve affect aggregate demand. So policymakers affect aggregate demand. By and large, things like the infrastructure bill affect aggregate supply ultimately in the long run, and aggregate demand both. But most policy affects demand, and demand only, really. So, any other questions? We're about at the end of the time, but if anybody's got a last question, willing to take that.
I don't have anything.
I don't either. I haven't even had time to go through the questions. That's what I'm gonna do tonight.
Okay. Yeah, because those will be useful. And as you go through the questions from past exams or the review questions that they're related, then you should get to a point where you say, well, these all kind of seem the same, or some of them, and you start to see the patterns, and the answer to that is, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because
Right.
I was starting to feel crazy because I felt like I was writing or drawing the same graph, answering questions.
So yeah, it's mainly, I mean, there are only so many. So if we take it back from the whole model, right? It's either changes in long-run aggregate supply or changes in aggregate demand that cause the economy to move around, GDP to move around, right? GDP is sort of the foundation indicator of the economy, I'll say, right? It's not the only thing, Chapter 8 tells us like all the things move together generally, right? And our model shows that actually. So if you get to that point, you say, well, and generally long-run area supply curve is not going to shift. It can. Our homework question number 2. If you look at that, if you look at the solutions to that, you'll see that is a case where long-run area supply curve is going to shift as well. But so is aggregate demand. And so if you go back to chapter actually chapter 8, and you go back and, or even what I wrote at the beginning of the homework question for the homework number 6, the last homework, I give a little summary at the top of that homework assignment. Changes. So if nothing happens to shock the economy, we're going to stay at full employment. We're going to stay on the long run growth curve for the economy. Right? So something has to happen to move us away from full employment. So something has to shift IS or something has to shift LM. Bottom line, what shifts IS? Anything that shifts the I curve or the S curve in chapter 4. What are the things that cause those curves to shift? Changes in wealth, changes in expected future income, confidence about the economy. Those will change saving. We know about desired investment, anything that's going to affect expected future marginal productivity of capital, right? Those are things we all learned back in chapter 4. What causes shifts in those curves? And you can look back in those chapters to kind of lay that out. And that's what I would do in terms of a notes page. What are the things that affect shifts in those curves? Because those are the things that affect shifts in IS. What affects shifts in LM? Well, that's chapter 7, the money supply, the Federal Reserve, and changes in the price level. So if you can start to boil it down to those things and see how those things are connected, then you start, well, there are only so many questions you can ask. And if you look at those questions from previous exams, it might look like there are however many, I don't know, 16, however many are on
17, I think.
17. They're all variations on the theme. Most of them. Because most of the things have to do with, so if you're going to make a good bet about something, it's probably going to affect aggregate demand, but it's not necessarily, but that's a good place to start in your mind, right? Because it's a shift in IS or a shift in LM, all right? A shift in, those are the things. Shifts in aggregate demand are where things happen primarily. Not only, but primarily. It's only once in a while, like the homework question number 2, infrastructure bill, right? Or not bill, infrastructure law and spending that affects the productive capacity of the economy, affects the production function, long-run aggregate supply curve, but it also affects spending as well. Okay. So that one will shift long-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand. So I encourage you to look back at the solutions to the homework in question number 2 to see through that one. Yeah.
Are you going to be available tomorrow if we email you some questions?
Let me I'm going to pull my calendar up because I have to do that. So the afternoon, I will be pretty much tied. I will be tied up for, well, I'll be tied up for a good chunk of the afternoon. The morning, perhaps some, I will be somewhat available. It's like saying partly cloudy, all right?
Okay. Yeah, if I have questions, it's probably going to hit your inbox in the middle of the night. So morning works.
Yeah. I'm generally pretty late, but I'm not going to be up in the middle of the night. So you need to this is to Brittany, you need to keep up your good work on the last exam.
Thank you.
I'll just say that. You were, but I will tell you, and you know this. I mean, I know you know this. So you were further ahead the day before the exam on the last exam than you are today, given what you've said.
For sure. Yeah, my daughter's been sick and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was
yeah.
falling off the curb this week.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. And I'll remind everybody that, I mean, I didn't put that in, I just didn't put it in, 'cause I forgot to put it in the announcement, and I'll have the announcement up tonight about, everything for the exam. But this one, just remind everybody that this one counts for everybody. This is not one that gets dropped.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sad
And-
about that.
And you can see why that is, because this is the one that pulls everything together.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the final exam in a sense. We don't have a final exam. This is the last exam for the semester. So we have a project instead due at the end here. And I'll be writing about that too this week. So
Sounds good.
but I haven't said anything about it because I want you to just focus on the exam for tomorrow right now. And then we'll